Hello, good afternoon to all our listeners of the visionradio.net, and a special welcome to our Spaceship of the Mysteries listeners. This is Ivan Saron speaking to you. Today, the spaceship has come again with another mystery. Life itself is surrounded with so many mysteries that it is worth lighting our inner lamp to give light to our virtues. This will help us see the mysteries that surround us. Today, we are going to talk about the Gnosis of Leonardo da Vinci. Mainly, we are going to focus on the esoteric study of one of his masterpieces. I am referring to the Last Supper painting. We are going to talk about the art, science, philosophy, and religion embodied in this wonderful painting. When we talk about a subject like this, it is important to achieve a better understanding of what a genius, a sage, is like. It is to decipher the message he left, and mainly when, as we have mentioned, in addition to listed virtues, he was an artist, a scientist, a philosopher, and a religious man. We question the origin of so much wisdom. However, how did he get so much revelation? Unquestionably, we wonder, where did his wisdom come from? Last week, throughout our program, we talked about what Gnosis means. Our listeners who were with us last week know what we're talking about, but for those tuning in for the first time, allow me to give you a brief summary. Gnosis is the Greek word meaning wisdom. We have said in reality, we all have Gnosis inside of us. What happens is, sometimes, we get distracted and lose our Gnosis. When this happens, we get disconnected from wisdom, and as a consequence, the human beings fall into disgrace. That is what has happened to humankind for centuries and centuries. We remind those who arrive for the first time that art is a search for beauty and is accompanied by something aesthetic. Not all artistic expressions can be called art. Art must be something pretty and beautiful. In addition, it should convey a teaching. Science is experimentation. To experience something, to have no doubt. Gnosis does not accept speculation. It ought to be lived. It is a living experience. Being a Gnostic or a practitioner of Gnosis is one who lives it directly, not taken from some pages of a book. No. A Gnostic practitioner is someone who has turned his knowledge into blood and has turned that into flesh. It is someone who has made it a part of their life. When we talk about Gnosis, we must identify the main columns: art, science, and philosophy. Philosophy means the love of wisdom. Philosophy is where love is found, and art is found in love. In other words, if you fall in love with wisdom, you are becoming a philosopher. You have to love wisdom, because when you love wisdom, you are freed from so many difficulties. Another column is religion, which means to unite, to reconnect. We have to recognize that everything is united. Unfortunately, we see things the opposite way, as if everything is separate. In religion, heaven and earth are united. Before talking about the Gnosis of Leonardo da Vinci, let's talk a little about who Leonardo da Vinci was, a man who would definitely classify above the level of a common man. Leonardo da Vinci lived until he was 67 years old, from April 15th, 1452 to May 2nd, 1519. He was a polymath. What is a polymath? A wise man who covers knowledge of various fields: art, science, philosophy, and religion. I am going to make the following statement, and at the end of the program, feel free to agree or disagree with me. My statement is as follows. Leonardo da Vinci was a Gnostic, a polymath, an individual with knowledge encompassing various disciplines. Most of the ancient philosophers were polymaths. Leonardo da Vinci was a Florentine of the Italian Renaissance. He was at the same time a painter, anatomist, architect, paleontologist, artist, botanist, scientist, writer, sculptor, philosopher, engineer, inventor, musician, poet, and many other virtues. His first major works were created in Milan in the service of Duke Ludovico Sforza. He worked in Rome, in Bologna, Venice, and spent his last years in France. He has often been described as a great archetype and symbol of the Renaissance period. He has been recognized as a universal genius as well as a philosopher, a humanist. His infinite curiosity led him to do everything he aimed. His creativity and inventive ability is unmatched. Leonardo da Vinci is considered one of the greatest painters of all time. Unquestionably, we are talking about a great sage. One of the great painters of the times and probably the most talented person in multiple disciplines that has ever existed. As an engineer and inventor, Leonardo developed ideas far ahead of his time, such as the helicopter, the tank, the submarine, the automobile. Very few of his projects were ever built. As a scientist, Leonardo da Vinci achieved great advances in the areas of anatomy. He was even a physician. I am sure that our dear radio listeners of the Spaceship of the Mysteries and of the visionradio.net will agree that it is so worthy to spend this time listening about Leonardo da Vinci. If anyone has the opportunity to go to Italy, I highly recommend making a stop to visit Florence. It is a great city to enjoy. Another place to visit is Milan. In both places, there is plenty of art, wisdom, and religion to admire and enjoy. These are indeed sacred places. Not omitting, of course, the profuse science that existed there. The area in which Leonardo da Vinci is most well known is painting. Two of his best-known works, La Gioconda, also known as the Mona Lisa, and The Last Supper, have been copied and parodied on several occasions. Another of his remarkable works is The Vitruvian Man. Leonardo da Vinci was a prodigy of the perspective, as shown in the composition of The Last Supper. This painting follows strict perspective rules, with the vanishing point located exactly above the head of Jesus Christ. When we talk about the painting of The Last Supper, it is relevant to admire the details of this painting. To do so, it is needed to get a copy from the original image. Leonardo da Vinci spent 4 years working on this painting of The Last Supper. He began in 1494 and finished around 1498. Experts in the field have had difficulty determining the exact date in which the work was completed. At the present time, this masterpiece is in Milan. If you happen to visit Milan, it is quite worthy to plan to see this great work. Not everyone who comes to Milan has the opportunity to see the great work, so it's a privilege for humans to see it. Continuing our conversation about the Gnosis in the work of Leonardo da Vinci, we are going to talk specifically about one of his most important works. This painting has in every image, in every corner of it, so much symbolism that it's not enough to have an hour to reflect on this painting. What we are doing is something very brief, a concise study to awake interest in inquisitive minds. It is a simple summary, very short, compared to the greatest of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. In the Last Supper, we find a very special symbolism. We find the 12 apostles, 12 signs of the zodiac. Each of the disciples of Jesus represents one of the signs of the zodiac. Each of his apostles represents the 12 saviors, 12 teachings, 12 truths, 12 precious stones, and 12 precious gems. When we talk about the Last Supper, we are talking about a covenant of love. It is hard to believe there's someone in any corner of the world who wouldn't perceive the immeasurable love displayed in this painting. What follows after the fulfillment of this pact of love, after the Last Supper, Jesus, the Christ, traced his path and left it open for us. What followed after the Last Supper was a profound teaching in each station of the cross. The stations of the cross demand a radical change, a total transformation. What a blessed change, blessed dinner, blessed gift from the divinity. To achieve any change, we have to embrace art, science, philosophy. We have to embrace religion. I'd like now to ask a question to our listeners. Would you participate in a dinner having the knowledge that soon after you will lose your life? Only Jesus could do that as an act of love for humanity, because it represented a divine Christian drama. Jesus knew all of the unfolding events after the Last Supper. He knew it was the beginning of his Calvary, the beginning of his becoming a martyr. What about you? Would you participate in a dinner of this kind? We will say that we have done a thorough analysis of the Last Supper when we take time to look at it and observe all the details in it. When we have in front of us the painting of the Last Supper, and we concentrate on it, we become serene. We enter into quietness. We draw from it patience, tolerance, humility, and love. We need to be in remembrance of God. The more we practice, the better we become. Observation is a great asset, and eyes are a great help. We have to be smart to be selective. We ought to place the eyes where art is. Coming back to my previous question, would you participate in a dinner of this type? Surely, some would answer that they would attend to that kind of dinner if it is for the benefit of the family. Others would answer that they would attend if the friends were benefited. But would you attend a dinner that is for the benefit of strangers? Without the cosmic drama of the Last Supper, the unfolding mandated events would not occur. There would not be martyrdom. there would not be crucifixion. And without crucifixion, there would be no resurrection. Without the fulfillment of the resurrection, we would have lost humanity. What would the fate of this humanity might look like? The Messiah died on the cross. Look at the Messiah. He celebrated a magical dinner, a miraculous dinner, full of wonders, with full awareness of what was coming. So, we all participate in the Last Supper. In some way, we are part of it. All of humanity has benefited from the Last Supper because the Last Supper is a religion that teaches us to reconnect, to unite. The Last Supper is like a solar system where Jesus represents the sun by virtue of being in the center. The sun travels around the constellations throughout the year. Leonardo da Vinci, as an astrologer and a scientist, was able to visualize this. Blessed sage. The Last Supper is associated with the 12 zodiacal constellations. That is why it's worth looking up to the sky. We have even forgotten to look at the sky. Whoever becomes a devotee to looking at the sky will become a sage. If we carefully observe the Last Supper, we will see that all of the disciples are in groups of 3. Each sign of the zodiac has an apostle as a representative. For instance, Mark symbolizes the lion, the fire. Luke symbolizes the bull, earth. Matthew, a young man who represents the water. And John, represented as an eagle, is air. What happens at the Last Supper? Jesus is instructing his disciples. He is teaching not only his disciples, but all of humanity. Observe the masterpiece of Leonardo da Vinci carefully. There is indeed something profound. Jesus is the central point of the Last Supper. The open position of his arms denotes he bears a more relevant role from the rest of the group. We see Mark here, who is the one who guards the love of the divine mysteries. There's also Luke, who represents the solar gospel. He is the prophet who foretells the times to come. For the one who is righteous, for the one who acknowledges his sins, one will have a new opportunity. When we go through the kind of tragedy we are experiencing nowadays, we might recognize that it is true when we live hardships, difficult situations. Later on, something wonderful will come. Lucas is the bearer of those news, the one who announces this. In Gnostic philosophy, it is said that the Koradi race is coming. Philip is the one who represents astral travels or to travel in the world of dreams. Who has not dreamed? He is the one linked with the search of the heavens. When we feel defeated by life, identified with negative impressions, when we have the feeling that we have been thrown in the labyrinth of hell and we feel like we're going down in a downward spiral, when we feel we're running out of hope, that is a time to hold on with the rest of our strength and not to succumb to any feelings of despair. Even with the last uttered murmur, we call Philip reciting, "To the heavens, Philip, to the heavens, Philip, to the heavens, Philip." By doing this invocation with faith, we will be surprised by the results. It is a powerful invocation flying to the heavens. Let us talk about John the Baptist, the one who can be found in Eden. John the Baptist was always at the side of Jesus. He was an essential part in the whole journey of Jesus. Andrew reminds us of the urgent need for our virtues to be born and for the psychological death of those defects dwelling in us which are so harmful. Andrew reminds us of the need for a conscious sacrifice to be done in order to attain a virtue. Enlightenment only occurs when we make conscious sacrifices. Saints, or those who have the yearning to become a saint, kneel. Those who acknowledge their sins also kneel and become holier when they learn to kneel with devotion. This act of humility can even be done secretly, without anyone seeing it. That is a teaching from Andrew, the one who is present at the Last Supper. He is the one who reminds us that we have to perform a revolution within ourselves. We'd like to invite all of our radio listeners to our program next Wednesday. We were going to talk about the Mona Lisa, the Gioconda. We're going to reflect on this profound and mysterious work. Who's the Mona Lisa? She is the mother. We're going to talk about the mother. Coming back to our topic of the day, we have been discussing the Last Supper and its author, Leonardo da Vinci. We have been talking about him as a practitioner because it is unquestionably that for an individual to attain so much wisdom, he undoubtedly had tremendous inner work. That man went beyond the ordinary development. He embodies the wisdom in his works. Let's talk about Thomas, who is seen in the painting too. Thomas represents an intimate relationship. He stands for the work done with patience. We have to learn to work with patience, with tolerance, with humility, with love. Thomas portrays a mind which at times can become very complicated. Human beings sometimes are very complicated. We get very complicated because the mind thinks and overthinks, getting us into a lot of trouble. We have to be aware with the mind. Sometimes the mind could be dangerous because one comes to believe many things that the mind creates, many untruthful thoughts. It is important to understand the mind. When one understands the mind goes into science. When we talk about all the symbolism, we're also talking about the same symbolism that coexists within us once we make the inner connection. I hope you're enjoying this program. If so, it is because through his work, through the Last Supper, Leonardo da Vinci is able to convey meanings. At the same time, we are open vessels to perceive that symbolism. What the great Savior has helped us realize is that there are many virtues within us. However, we do not only see them, but we are able to activate them within us. There's also Matthew, the apostle of pure science. Matthew means gift of God. Matthew speaks about terribly divine things. Matthew is the one who speaks at the end of the times. He is a tax collector. He represents the law. We like to be paid, to receive checks, but we don't like being charged. That is why we need to understand how Matthew's role works. We might wonder, who is in charge nowadays of this humanity? Without hesitation, we can say the law, Matthew. The law is very active. For this reason, we have to have our affairs in order. Let's talk about James. James is the path to enlightenment, the one who helps us achieve great transformations within us. At this point, there is a question we ought to ask ourselves. What is the Mercury of the sage? How are we born? Where do we come from? How did our birth take place? We are born from the Mercury of the sages, from the most sacred energy that each human being has within. With this, we state that anyone who truly commits to crystallizing the inner work is able to incarnate God, and by doing so, a human being could fuse with God. When a man and a woman unify with the force of the sacred energy, a new human being can be born. If we sublimize that same energy and direct that energy towards the divine, that Mercury is able to make us attain wisdom. Judas is also in the painting. He represents death, the death of psychological defects, the dissolution of the negative within us. If we allow the force of evil which dwells within each of us to take over oneself, we end up living a bitter life. Unfortunately, sometimes we go beyond ourselves and make the life of the people who surround us miserable too. In certain religious or philosophical teachings, there is a shared saying, we must put our inner demons to death. You have to understand that from time to time, we become like Judas. At some point, we have played that role. You have to recognize this, and when you recognize it and you feel remorse, when you see it, it can become something great. Without Judas, the cosmic drama would not have been fulfilled. We continued here talking about the Gnosis of Leonardo da Vinci. We have been talking about his art, science, philosophy, and religion. His remarkable act of achieving perfection in the setting of the most accurate scene. It is said that around the end of 1494, Leonardo bought a copy of the Bible, surely an Italian translation. It can be assumed that he did it in order to educate himself and display the most exact expressions for the painting of the Last Supper. The painting is a composition that reveals first-hand knowledge of texts from Gospels. Experts state that Leonardo da Vinci was not a believer, and the supposed experts assume that Leonardo da Vinci strongly aimed to recreate the scene with the maximum realism. We ask you, listeners of the Spaceship of the Mysteries, was Judas truly a traitor? Following the format we have always used, we're going to answer this question right now. Leonardo paints Judas with evil features. In the painting, Judas grabs a bag with the 30 coins with his right hand. That is the amount he was paid to carry out the betrayal. His left is on the same plate just as Jesus' hand is. This means that Judas' hands are busy. He is also the only apostle whose face is in the shadows. Note here that Leonardo is unlikely to deliberately portray his characters with Semitic features. Semitic traits means Hebrew, Israeli, or Jewish physical features. This is the description we have for Judas there. This is a wonderful subject because the Last Supper is so detailed it almost seems as if Leonardo da Vinci took a photo of these exact ongoing moments. Behind Judas there is a hand holding a knife. Whose hand is it? It is unknown who is bearing the knife because it is an isolated hand. It is not connected to a body whatsoever. That hand cannot belong to Judas because he is holding the bag of coins with one hand and taking bread with the other hand. This is something enigmatic and mysterious. Today, we are reflecting on the Gnosis of Leonardo da Vinci. We're talking about the art, science, philosophy, and religion of the Last Supper. We're talking about one of the greatest artists ever lived. We are trying to understand where his wisdom comes from. And we say that Leonardo da Vinci was unquestionably a practitioner. A practitioner of what? A practitioner aiming to awaken the virtues. Because there are virtues. We have to enjoy them. We have to activate them. We must do as Jesus did. For every attack of hate, he returned love instead. To continue on the comments about the knife seen in the Last Supper, the knife behind Judas, we repeat the question. Whose hand is that? You can see the hands of the apostles if you pay close attention. There is a mysterious hand, so we ask, is it possible that the knife represents betrayal? Could that knife represent the devil? Whose hand is it? Could it be from someone who is not invited to the dinner? Could it be that there's a hidden enemy who is listening to the conversation he shouldn't? And on top of all that, the person who was not invited most likely is the one holding the knife in his hand. In my personal opinion, I do not want to participate in a Holy Family event without being invited. We continue talking about the Gnosis of Leonardo da Vinci. We are also describing scenes from his wonderful painting, which is a patrimony of humanity. Let us now talk about John, who is known as the favorite. He was identified like that in the Gospels. John is the youngest disciple. He traditionally has been represented with adolescent features, sometimes even with feminine features. How does Leonardo handle this? In addition, we ask, who is John? Is that really John? The novelist Dan Brown has made a peculiar interpretation which has become famous. According to Brown, the figure in question would not be of John, but that of Mary Magdalene, the wife of Jesus Christ, whom Jesus entrusted his legacy. You do not have to believe what I'm talking about. Let us determine the source. Let's go back to the author of the painting, Leonardo da Vinci, and make us aware of who Leonardo da Vinci was. At this point, we can define who we're talking about. We're talking about a genius, a Renaissance genius, a universal genius, a philosopher, an engineer, a doctor, a paleontologist, an artist, a botanist, a scientist, a writer, inventor, musician, and a poet. Our listeners have the free will to interpret each scene according to their own sense, but the image painted at the dinner is clearly not the features of a man, but of a woman. That is my perception. You, our listener, might have your own visual perception of this image. Leonardo da Vinci seemed like he was taking a photo of the most sacred and dangerous supper that has ever existed in the history of our humanity. He portrayed Christ, the Savior, with great fidelity to the text of the Gospels. Leonardo shows Christ surrounded by his disciples, to whom he says, "From true I tell you, that one of you has to betray me." Then everyone asks, "Is it me, sir?" There is when the photo is taken. And then he says, "He, the one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me, will betray me." To make the statement stronger, Leonardo represents this particular scene in larger size than the others in that painting. He used body language to show the expression. You can observe the posture of Jesus' arms, emphasizing the exclamation. The language of hands appears clearly in that scene. Leonardo paid particular attention to the gestures of the people. The way they moved their hands seemed like it constituted a natural language that was especially effective in the painting. One could say that the body language replaced oral language. It was an art that could be defined as silent poetry. Of all his works, The Last Supper is indubitably the one that represents the greatest variety of hand gestures, which are so expressive, maybe even more expressive than faces. That is the expression seen in Philip, making a protest of innocence. It can be read like he is conveying at the moment the expression, "It was not me," showing his astonishment. Simon describes the gestures, his explanation. John, by joining his hands, expresses his sadness, and there is Judas expressing his attention of listening to what is being said. Would it be possible that all this was a planted plan and that Judas did not betray Jesus? Could it be possible that we, mankind of these times, have misinterpreted the role of Judas? According to the painting by Leonardo da Vinci, the great sage, we might get another version of history. Could it be that Leonardo da Vinci was able to portray what really happened? Today we have been talking about the Gnosis of Leonardo da Vinci, which has within it art, science, philosophy, and religion. We should know that Gnosis exists in the hearts of each and every one of us. we have to gather that Gnosis together and connect it with our inner wisdom. Those who connect with their inner wisdom free themselves from all evil and danger, because those who are wise do not fear any evil. This has been the end of our Spaceship of Mysteries ride. We will be very happy to see you again next Wednesday. This is your host, Ivan Saron. I wish you all a very good night, and don't forget to get a copy of the painting of the Last Supper if you don't have it. If you do, I invite you to observe it and reflect on this masterpiece to discover the great mysteries, because there are mysteries. Thank you very much.